Hello, everyone, and welcome to Dynamic Dialogue for September of 2024. I can't believe how fast the time goes.
Yeah.
So today our topic is going to be talking about tariffs and the supply chain, and actually even more than just the tariffs themselves, but what effect they have and what they're intended to do, and the whole makeup of the globe and the supply chains and consumers and marketplaces, because I think all that's really important. So, for those of you who might be new this time, we talk about all kinds of supply chain topics every month. Our format is monthly at 11:30 on Tuesday, on the fourth Tuesday of the month, 11:30 Pacific time. We do lots of things. This is open to dialogue, thoughts, questions, resources, whatever. I do a presentation that's always less than an hour, and the link that you have for today is going to be good through the end of 2025. So we keep these free and open to the public, and I probably will be sending out a survey shortly for many of you to ask you what kinds of topics you'd like to see in 2025. So let's dive into this. We're going to talk about tariffs, and we'll talk about duties too, because there's some confusion around that. We're going to talk about trade balance, and then we're going to talk about some of the impacts on not only supply chains, but on businesses and on people kind of in general. So this is kind of a general presentation because I think it's important to understand some of the distribution of finances, wealth around the world, as well as where things are made and where things are consumed. So let's dive into the definitions, as I always start with definitions of these topics. So tariffs are really a type of tax that are imposed on goods either imported or exported by a government or a supranational union. So that's a new word for me, supranational. I'm not sure how to do it. But what that means is it has the power of influence that transcends national boundaries. So it can be international organizations, political unions, political laws, or it even can be multiple trade agreements. So if several countries have a trade agreement, then these supranational organizations can impose these tariffs. So tariffs are used for a variety of things. They're used to generate revenue. They're used for regulation, for protectionism, and for import substitution. So what they are designed to do is to generate revenue for the federal government. They help regulate the trade in and out of a country. And it's not just in the US. These tariffs are found worldwide. Many countries have a variety of tariffs that they institute. They are for protectionism, to protect domestic businesses typically, and then to discourage or restrict imports that might be substitutes for products that are made locally, domestically. And again, I'm going to use the US because that's where we are and that's where most of us relate to, but it's not restricted to the US. For example, a French tariff is supposed to keep things out of France. So, and to restrict that trade. So these can be fixed or variable, meaning they can be some dollars per unit, or affixed to the quantity, or a percentage of the price. And these are instituted in different ways, depending on the good, depending on the tariff itself, depending on the time. And they're also used to reduce trade deficits with another country. So it's to restrict things or to tax things coming in from another country so that you can try to balance the deficit with that country. Duties are also taxes on imported goods, services, and transactions. Tariffs usually don't apply to services or other transactions, but duties can apply to that. And duties are typically based on the value of those goods or services. And they're typically based on the product characteristics themselves versus tariffs, which are applied to specific goods from specific countries for specific time periods. So there's a lot of overlap there, but there is a lot of commonality too. So just to kind of clarify those 2 points. So there's a lot of pros and cons about tariffs. The benefits are they can be really good in the short run in certain cases. They drive consumers to domestically made products when those products are available. So the tariffs on an imported good can drive the price up on that and encourage consumers to go to the domestically made products when they are available. It can stymie competition from foreign made products, foreign produced products. It can protect companies and their employees in the United States, the domestic ones. So again, if you have tariffs and that prevent other things coming in, that can mean that the U.S. Jobs on those companies are going to be able to keep producing and their employees are still going to be employed because it's restricting the amount of competition that is allowed in. It also protects tier 2 and tier 3 suppliers. So again, back to supply chain, there are many companies that produce small companies, mom and pop stores that produce lots of products that support the tier 1 manufacturers and companies that reside here in the United States. And companies often like to buy at least some of their product domestically and closer to home if they can. So they use these tier 2 and tier 3 businesses. These are typically they're small and medium-sized businesses, but these are a lot of times the heart and soul of a region or a community or just the United States. Our small businesses make up a lot of the employment. So they help the companies that manufacture domestically and supply to them. And it does raise revenue on a federal level. So there are a lot of benefits from that. Here's an example. In the 1980s, Harley-Davidson was the last U.S. manufacturer of motorcycles that was producing here in the United States. And at that point in time, they had some significant quality problems, but they also had significant market challenges coming from lower priced Japanese motorcycles. And these motorcycles coming from Japan were really in danger of flooding the marketplace and driving Harley-Davidson out of business. And they'd been in business like 120 years. So there was a lot of support for trying to keep Harley-Davidson as a viable company. Reagan was the president at the time, and he increased tariffs on imported motorcycles to 45%. So this was a huge tariff put on these Japanese motorcycles that were threatening to take Harley-Davidson's business marketplace and really drive them out of business. But this 45% tariff was scheduled to scale down on a 10 to 20% per year over 4 years. And what this did, in essence, is it gave Harley-Davidson time to kind of get their act together and become more competitive. As a result, they were able to grow their market share from about 30 or 35% to 50% and a little over that over about 10 years. And they were able to stay as a viable company and keep those jobs and, be the iconic Harley-Davidson that we all know and recognize. And probably many of us have been to the Harley-Davidson showrooms. People collect those hats and the t-shirts and all that kind of stuff. They're all over the world, not just here in America. But in that case, the tariffs had a specific target of what they were trying to do with the motorcycle industry, and in particular with Harley-Davidson, because they were the only company, U.S. company producing motorcycles at that time. But tariffs also have some downsides too. They can be counterproductive over the long run, meaning that they keep the prices on the goods coming in at a higher level, because in essence, what happens is that tariffs need to be paid. So they are paid upon importing the different products. So if you buy products that come, maybe you're buying Halloween costumes that come from China, then these, if they have a tariff on them, that has to be paid at the point of customs when it comes into the country, or it's not allowed in the country. So I don't believe that there's tariffs on Halloween companies or on, I mean, Halloween costumes, nor do I believe there should be, but that was just an example. So if they have to be paid, they are typically paid by the importer of record. And here in the United States, we have a lot of US companies that have chosen to produce overseas. They've outsourced a lot of products, parts, assemblies, sub-assemblies, lots of different things. And then they have to, if they want to sell those in the United States, then that company that is producing that, say in Asia, actually has to import that back into the United States for sales. And if you look at some of the companies today that are making electric vehicles, we all know Tesla's making electric vehicles, and Rivian is now doing that, and there are some other companies doing that. But a lot of the bigger companies, the more traditional car companies, are producing a lot of their electric vehicles in China, almost exclusively. If they're produced in China and they want to be sold in the US, then they need to be imported. And so if you want to keep those tariffs there for a long time, if it's General Motors building in China and importing into the United States, they're going to have to assume the cost of that because it's General Motors doing that production. Even though if they're paying another Chinese company to do it as a subcontractor, General Motors is bringing those cars back into the company. So then General Motors is going to have to pay those tariffs. When General Motors pays higher prices to suppliers for anything and everything, that goes into their cost model, and that has to be reflected in the pricing that they charge consumers for those same goods. So when General Motors outsources and then turns around and imports these products, whether it's a whole car or just parts for a car, then if they're the ones that are actually doing the assembly, they have to pay those tariffs to get those into the car, which is going to increase their cost of doing business, their cost of production, and therefore that will get passed on to consumers. So there's been some debate about that, but that's in essence what happens. Manufacturers may pay the tariff if it is, in this case, if they are both the importer and the manufacturer in another country. So General Motors can have a plant in Hong Kong, and if they produce parts there and then import it, they are both the manufacturer and the importer, and they're going to pay those prices. So they can drive consumer prices significantly, and they can drive them on domestically made products. They can also negate other positive economic results, because if we want to retain jobs and things like that, but we have to pay higher prices on tariffs, then that's going to probably drive prices up here, and that's going to probably price some companies into having to reduce their workforce and do different things. So these things have to be measured and balanced. Disadvantages: increased cost to consumer when those increases are passed to consumers, which is quite often. And economists agree tariffs negatively affect economic growth and welfare over a period of time. So for a very short period of time, they might not be that impactful, but over a longer period of time, medium to longer time, the economists agree almost unanimously that tariffs can negatively affect and will negatively affect economic growth. So we've been through a lot of tariffs here in the United States in the last few years. And I can tell you that tariffs implemented on China between 2018 and 2019 raised about $80 billion of revenue on about $300 billion worth of imported goods. And yet the trade deficit with China during that time rose. So even though there were significant tariffs placed on products, the trade deficit with China was higher in 2020 than it was in 2018. And then the U.S.-China Business Council also reported that 245,000 jobs were lost in the U.S. because of these tariffs. The higher cost of these goods being passed on to companies and then passed on to consumers. For example, there were significant tariffs put on aluminum and steel, if you remember. So you have to look at how these tariffs are applied and assigned and enacted. So initially, the tariffs, which were like up to 25% on aluminum, and I believe steel too, maybe not as high on the steel, but they were on bulk aluminum and steel. So they were on coils of material. They were on sheets of big sheets of aluminum, 4x8 sheets. So it was more raw material for companies than finished goods. I know of a local company here that bought a lot of sheet metal, and they bought a lot of sheet metal, like aluminum sheets and aluminum aluminum raw material. And then they had their own internal machine shops here in the States where they produced most of their goods. And they liked that model, being able to produce the goods. So when these tariffs were enacted, they were enacted against the raw materials, not against finished goods. So when this company did the analysis and looked at it, they said, you know what? We can buy these parts now made cheaper in China because the tariffs are not applied on the parts themselves, on produced parts. They're tariffs were enacted on the raw material, the raw forms of aluminum and steel that were brought into the country. So with the idea of reducing reliance on aluminum and steel from China, it had the opposite effect. For this one particular company that did a lot of business, it's $1 billion company. And I'm sure a lot of other companies recognize the same thing and continue to do that when tariffs are enacted. So instead of producing as many parts as they had before these tariffs, they shut down about a third of their production capacity for making sheet metal and went to buying the finished parts from overseas, from companies in China and other places in Asia, because suddenly it was cheaper to do that than to buy the raw material and make it themselves. So that's how jobs get lost when tariffs are applied. And I am not a fan of all politicians. I know that politicians are not business people. Business people tend to be a little political, but sometimes they're not as good at politics as politicians are. And so, but there's oftentimes that we see politicians who have good intentions, but don't understand supply chains, don't understand the ramifications of what they do in terms of passing laws and getting those laws implemented and the results on the economy. So we have to be careful about that. As supply chain professionals, we need to be aware of that and to make sure that we're looking out for the best interest of our business. So then we have pluses and minuses for that. And then we have the fact that the US is a very interestingly positioned in the world. So the world population, I looked this up earlier today, and it was 8,178,414 and right around 400. If you look at some of these clocks, as you sit there and watch them, they click from 396, 397, whatever. So it was about that earlier today. I picked that number up. And we are expected to reach on the planet by 2037, 9 billion people and 10 billion people by 2060. So we are growing in population, not as quickly and not as drastically as the world population has grown in the last, say, 50 to 100 years, but it's still a pretty good clip. So we are growing the population of the world. We are not in the United States growing nearly as quickly as some other countries. So our population is fairly stagnant. And if you hear some different people talk about that, one big voice on that is Elon Musk saying that we need to have more children in this country, especially to keep that population growing. Others are happy to say, no, our population is pretty flat and we can manage that. So it's a very personal decision, but we need to look at that in context of the rest of the world. So I don't know that I'm going to be around in 2060, but I intend to be around and being part of the business world in 2037, which is a few short years away, 13 years. And so we need to look at where we are. And it's interesting also to look at the other countries that have the population. So we are third in the world, with 4.2% of the world's population. So only 4.2% of the world's population are in the United States. India has 17%, China has 17%. And if you don't know, India passed China about 15 months ago, and they are growing faster than China. India's population growth is probably still the steepest in the world if you look at some of those trends. And so you can see together, India and China are well over a third of the world's population. There's quite a lot of the population is there, and you can look at it by land mass too, and it's kind of interesting. But I'm going to show you some different ways to look at what's going on in the world, not just in terms of population, but in terms of wealth and in terms of GDP. So you can see after Indonesia, these are the countries that we go, and I have another chart to kind of show that. But Indonesia is the fourth largest country in the world, 3.4% of the population. And then it goes Pakistan, Nigeria, Brazil, Bangladesh, Russia down even farther at 1.7% of the world's population. Ethiopia, Mexico, Japan, 1.5%. So you can see there's not a lot of differential in these countries in here. The Philippines, Congo, Iran, Turkey, Germany, 1.04% of the world's population, and down to the UK, which is less than 1%. So you can see that a number of these countries are what we consider third world countries that do not have the wealth, the infrastructure, and the development level that many others do. If you look at these top few countries, we stand out, the US as third, and then we go down to Japan and Germany and the UK, which are in there, but at very small numbers. So this is where we are in terms of people. And that's important because people equal consumers, right? People equal the amount of goods that are going to be consumed and where things are going to be needed going forward. So here's another population one you can see again, India, China, the United States. This is just a different way to look at it. Again, Japan down at number 12, Philippines 14, Germany down to 19, the UK is 21, South Africa 24, down to 30, which is Sudan. South Korea, which is a company that we all are familiar with if you buy Samsung anything, they are a South Korean company, then that is a lot of the activity there is doesn't translate into people, even though South Korea, like Seoul, South Korea is a huge city, much bigger than it's like the sixth or eighth largest city in the world, bigger than Los Angeles and I believe New York. But the wealth is not quite the same. So here's wealth in terms of countries. So United States is up there at 30%. Then we go down to China, which again is number 2 on the population, number 2 in wealth, but at a much different percentage. 30% of the similar percentage is actually 17-18% of the population, 17-18% of the wealth. Then we go down to Japan, Germany, the UK. So again, companies that we are more familiar with, that we do business with more, that have higher standards of living. France, India, Canada, Italy, South Korea, and then the rest of the world at 24%. So you can see that these top few countries, and if you look at the United States and China combined, that's almost 50%. So almost 31%. And almost 19% is just the US and China alone is 50% of the wealth. But wealth isn't always just a number, and it's not kind of a definitive. So let's look at a couple different things. Here's the same kind of chart with the world wealth. And again, you can see those same kind of countries up there, different ways to look at it. And this one actually does some other interesting things and looks at like Asia and Oceania combined. That has 39% of the wealth. North America with the United States and Canada is about 33%. So those two countries combined don't equal Asia and Oceania, which will include things like Indonesia and like that. Europe, 23%, even though the small countries in Europe like Germany and the UK, France are all about 3%. If you look at all of Europe as an aggregate, it's 23%. Latin America and the Caribbean, very small, goes down to 3%. And Africa, which has some of the largest population, is down to 1.3% of the world wealth. So it's a very small percentage, and yet it's very disparate. It's disparate when it comes to looking at the population. And I see that this has Brazil and down there at the 1% kind of thing. So these are small numbers in that, and they've added in these aggregate numbers just for context to kind of show you where they are. So interesting information. That's world wealth. But if we look at household wealth, it changes a little bit. The United States, China, Japan, Germany's higher there, the United Kingdom, France. So these are a lot more familiar countries to us in this area. And then we see Taiwan in here as another one. The Netherlands, Switzerland comes up, and then the rest of the world at 15% percentage. But United States for household wealth is at 31%. Again, 4% of the population, and yet 31% of the wealth. China on balance a little bit. Japan, 5% of the wealth, which is a little bit higher than its percentage of population, which is very small. So some very great disparities, which need to be handled in some way by supply chains, by consumers that are buying XYZ and that are selling and making and whatever. So we're looking at where the wealth is, and we're looking at where some of the production is. So for GDP, let's look at the gross domestic product, which you probably have heard this term, but not everyone knows what this means. It is a measure of the value of the goods and services produced in a country or region over a period of time. And economists consider it a key indicator of the country's economic health, and they use it to make economic policies and investments. So again, for GDP, the gross domestic product, United States is number one, 25.46. So by any stretch, if that's the value of the goods and services produced in this country, then for 4% of the population to produce the 25% of the GDP in the world, that's a pretty good number. And that also looks at things like productivity, efficiency, and those kinds of things. China comes in again at number 2. They are stuck in that 17% kind of number. That's for their population, that's for their wealth, that's for their GDP. So you can see that they have $17 trillion in GDP, but that they do that with 17% of the population versus the US producing 25% of the world's GDP with only 4% of the population. Then again, Japan, very high on the GDP. Germany, India is trending upward in this area where they are not as much in the wealth area. They're a little bit lower. The UK, France, Russia. So these are the top 11 or 12. I think there's 11 here of the GDP. But not even GDP tells the whole story, because there's another way to look at GDP, which is GDP-PPP. And this shows the gross domestic product with the purchasing power parity, which is the PPP. And if you note by this that many of the world's richest countries by this measure are also the smallest countries. And the effects of world economic conditions on some of these countries are going to be um, fairly negligible, because to calculate this, you divide the GDP by the number of full-time residents. So this gives us another perspective. This is a really interesting chart, because we've just looked at GDP where we see the US, China, Japan, Germany, blah, 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 same kind of litany, right? But per capita, with the purchasing power parity, the United States only ranks ninth. Luxembourg ranks first, but Luxembourg doesn't move needles on any scale, because they are such a tiny little country with population, with um, square miles, with GDP, with all these numbers, but their ratio of that to their people is very high. Ireland is up there very high. Singapore, which has for the last few decades been very um, focused on being a player in the world marketplace and branching out. They manage a lot of suppliers for different countries, for different companies in different countries, including India and China and other Asian countries. Macau, which is a tiny little country. Macau, if you know, is famous for casinos and things like that, but their gross domestic product divided by their purchasing power parity is very high. So the UAB, the Arab Emirates, is up there, Switzerland, San Marino, and then the United States. And if you go on down to these, you can see that there's really no significant other countries on this list. Netherlands is probably the highest, Iceland, but those are low in population, low in total wealth, low in GDP. But this says that they have some purchasing power. And again, some of these countries, notably the Qatar, the Arab Emirates, some of these other countries, are not as affected by world economic conditions because of this, that they are the richest countries by person in there. So an interesting way to look at it. But then you say, okay, so we understand where things are coming from, who's building what. We understand who's consuming, which is a lot of us here in the United States. We are big consumers. But where are the resources? So these are some snapshots of where resources are and who's producing what at this point. So this shows both the largest producer and the second largest producer. And I've got two charts on that. This one shows fossil fuels, nuclear fuel, and gemstones. And gemstones are, nice to have, but they're used for things like wealth, but they also are used in industrial uses. So diamonds are good for cutting and things like that. And fluorite goes into a lot of different products that go into our electronic products and things like that. So again, just a snapshot, but you can see the largest producer of coal is China, with the second largest in India. The US does produce a lot of coal, although it is down in recent years because of the dangers and the difficulty in coal mining, as well as the cost. United States is the largest producer of natural gas, but it's followed by Russia. Oil production. So oil production right now, the US is the largest producer of oil, but Russia is second. So these kind of go back and forth, and that these change from time to time. And yet we know that the Middle East, Saudi Arabia, a lot of other countries still have a lot of oil and are big producers there and have the potential to produce more. Uranium, which is interesting because uranium has several uses, including nuclear power stations. We don't have a lot of those in the United States. We have a few, but if you go to Europe, you will see lots of nuclear power plants. And that is becoming a widely accepted source of power around the globe, with the United States not catching on to that trend as quickly. Thorium, another nuclear fuel, India and China. So when we talk about relationships with these countries, we need to say, okay, what's what? If India produces the thorium or the uranium and we need that, then we need to be aware of that. And then and coal for China, we use for a lot of different resources and a lot of different types of things. And they sell all over the world to keep Europe and Eastern Europe warm in the winter, and we're coming up to winter time. So we can see how that works. Now, here's metals. This is a different kind of look at this. And some of these you may be familiar with, maybe not so much some of the others. But when you think about the electronics that we use, the products that we use, like things like cars and all the computers, all of the resources that go around that. If you look at aluminum, which is related to bauxite, China and India produce the aluminum, but the bauxite, the aluminum ore, comes from Australia and Guinea. So these are moved and changed around from like Australia. Australia produces aluminum too, but not at the rate that China does. But the ore is in Australia and Guinea. Bismuth, another kind of obscure metal, but China and Vietnam. Copper, which we're pretty familiar with. We have copper mines here in the United States, but it comes heavily from Chile and Peru. So South American countries that pop up to say, oh, this is where we're getting copper. And believe me, we use a lot of copper in the products that you and I use every day, including all of your electronics. Your houses are wired with copper wire. There are substitutes, but copper always comes back to being the preeminent one, the one that is the best. So copper, not from the United States, Chile and Peru. Chromium, South Africa and Turkey, little obscure countries there that produce chromium, which again goes into a lot of electronics. Gold, China and Australia. We think of gold often with South Africa, and it's not even the first or the second producer. So China produces gold. Gold again, big use in electronics. So when you think about U.S.-China relationships, we might need some of that. Australia also has gold mines, which is interesting. Iron ore comes from Australia and China, which is why China is a big producer in steel, because they have the iron ore and they can get to that and they can produce that. Lithium, Australia and Chile. Manganese, South Africa, China. Mercury, nickel. Nickel goes into a lot of other types of metal alloys, including steel and sometimes in aluminum. It comes from Indonesia and the Philippines predominantly. Niobium, palladium, platinum. Platinum is not just for show and jewelry. It is used again in electronics and some other types of things. Silver, Mexico and China. Tin, if you don't know tin is the primary solder that's used in electronic manufacturing. So all the circuit boards and things like that, where they used to use lead a lot, all the newer electronics have transformed over to tin in the last couple of decades. So we use tin solder on almost all of the electronics today in mass production. Lead solder is still used heavily for aerospace and defense, and also for medical applications. But for many of the electronic gadgets and brains that we use with our computers, we use tin solder for that. Titanium is very important. Another place to get titanium is Russia. And we use titanium in a lot of our aerospace applications. It's a very lightweight metal, but it's a very solid metal. It can withstand a lot of pressure and heat, and it's really a good use in aerospace and defense. So titanium, but where do we get it? China and Japan. And we know Japan isn't all that large. So, how much titanium can they have compared to a country like China? Vanadium and zinc. So again, a wide range of places. So when you look at what we consume in the United States, things like gold and tin and platinum, silver, nickel, aluminum, iron, a lot of those are consumed right here in the United States through various and sundry products that we buy, use, and go through day in and day out, year after year. Very little of that comes from the United States primarily. We are not the largest producer of that. So therefore, if we aren't the largest producer, we're probably going to have to import some of it since we are the largest consumer of that. So here's what I know for sure, and why I think there's a better way, is that the US is a big player in the world. No doubt. We are major in all of these categories, but even though we're third in population, we are dwarfed by either China or India, because we are 4%, they're over 16%. So they're 4 times as large population wise as we are. And yet, here we are with all of the consumption. A lot of the companies that drive world economies are located here in the United States or have big presence here. So you look at Toyota, you look at Samsung. Even though Samsung is a South Korean company, and Toyota is a Japanese company, TSCM, the Taiwanese semiconductor manufacturing company, is Taiwanese. A lot of what they make is consumed right here in the United States. So it has to get from those companies into the United States, from those production areas into the United States, even though Toyota has a big presence here in the US, and there is a division of Toyota that's US based. Used to be here in Los Angeles. Now it's in the Texas area. I think it's outside of Dallas, in kind of the Plano area. But Samsung has US locations and US presence as well. And TSMC is trying to move and morph out and grow in different ways, but they produce the huge percentage of the chips that are consumed in electronics today. So we are big importers, consumers, producers ourselves. We produce a lot here. And typically, again, tariffs are paid by the importer. So where is it coming from? If it has to get into here for us to consume, somebody's going to have to pay that tariff. And it's typically not the manufacturer themselves, it's the importer of record. And we don't have all the capacity. We don't have all the resources that we need here in the US to shut these other countries out or down. Companies are global. And so the way Toyota grows, the way General Motors grows, the way Apple grows is not just to look at the United States, but they want consumers, they want a marketplace in Italy, in India, in China, in these other countries, Indonesia, where there are lots and lots of people, as opposed to the 4% of the world that reside here in the United States. Yes, the balance of wealth is here, but the people themselves are not. And for them to grow at the rates they would like to grow throughout the next couple of decades and beyond, they're going to need other marketplaces. So it's important that we take all that in. So tariffs aren't always the right answer to do everything we want to do to manage our supply chains, to manage our costs, and to build our businesses and expand our businesses. It's important that we think about that, especially because in supply chain, we are the ones that select a lot of the suppliers. We are the ones that design the supply chains. We put the architecture together. We are looking now at, do we need to move production from one region, from one country, from one city to another? We look at what our goals are, what our options are, and how to move that forward. Which is why I think supply chain and CPOs are becoming more present, more frequent, more powerful within the company, because all of these decisions that are made revolve around that. So we have to think about what are our options and how do we employ those going forward. So if you would like to get more value, if you're committed to improving your company, improving your position, my calendar is open. You can go to this callwithjane.com. It takes you to my calendar. and you can pick a time to talk to me more about this. This is all free and available to whatever. I will talk about what you're doing with your company. I will talk about what we might be able to do together as a partnership and to try to move us forward. So we are going to continue dynamic dialogues on the fourth Tuesday of every month, except for December. I think we are skipping December, but we will be back in October. And I think in November, we might have a different day, but I'll advertise that. So next month in October, I'm going to talk about compliance and why it's not really an option for companies. Companies need full-on compliance programs, even small businesses. So if you don't have one, we're going to talk about why you might want to get one. I have CPSM classes going on. I just finished exam 1, but I'm happy to start another one if there's interest in that. And exam 2 could be starting as early as October, and it might get pushed out a little bit depending due to people's schedules and demand for that. So I would say it's probably going to be in January and not after that. But if you're interested, let me know about that. Our website, which is woefully outdated and needs to be updated, but you can go there. And you can always contact me directly at jane@purplelink.net. And I always like to leave you with something, strive to thrive. Sometimes this is a more inspirational thing, but I like this graphic because it really shows a lot about where people are and where people are in the world. So you can see here we have China and India, which are the behemoths, again, 36% or so of the world's population. There's the US with a little chunk at 4%, Brazil, Colombia, and on and on and on. So several different places. I don't see Indonesia. Oh, yeah, there's Indonesia next to China. In the top. So a bigger chunk there and then on down. So there's a lot of countries in the world, but there's a very much a disparity in distribution of wealth and capacity and infrastructure and a lot of other things. So think about that when you're managing your supply chain, when you're dealing with your suppliers and talking to your senior management about how to move forward, which suppliers you want to use. So that's what I have. I have a chat. Angela, you want to stick around? We can talk about exam 1. Let me stop. I'm going to stop the share and stop my recording.